People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
I've never told a joke in my life.
What is he doing? Why is he doing it?
What I'd like to do for you right now, it's called eating ice cream.
That's my pal. It's just as much torture if you're cutting them with a razor blade.
Wait, can you turn...
What kind of parental damage was done to this boy?
Well, I guess I'm what you call maybe a passionate man.
Always been attracted to bad boys.
Get lost, baby. I beat you.
Holy...
This is not even weird.
Women's lib was exploding.
Oh, Andy, please, no, don't do it.
Giving women an equal chance.
I think it's a stupid little wimp.
You're performing for an audience that doesn't know it's watching a show.
I just thought he was misguided.
He was just having fun.
What the
Finished?
Yeah, that's the shit off the camera.
I really relished taking us prisoner.
Why?
I didn't ask you.
Am I supposed to laugh at that?
Milk and cookies.
I think that was genius, actually.
I don't have any money.
Ladies and gentlemen, so far everything I have done for you tonight, really I am only fooling. This is really me. And everything else was just a character.
Here's a mirror. And people didn't like what they saw a lot of the time.
I would still like to know who the real Andy is.
Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of The Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. On this episode, I am talking with Alex Braverman. He is the director of the new documentary, Thank You Very Much. It is all about Andy Kaufman, the comedic genius of the 1970s and 80s. I used to complain that when it came to the Man in the Moon movie, I really would have rather been watching a documentary about Kaufman. Well, here it is. Here's one of them at least. I know we just spoke with Andrew Buss about his book Superbad, but he is also producing a documentary about Kaufman, so we might have competing Kaufman documentaries, which for me, that's great. I am going to be a pig in slop when it comes to Andy Kaufman stuff. If you want more Andy Kaufman, why don't you go on over to subcin, that is subcin.wordpress.com. There is a documentary over there called The Passion of Andy Kaufman from 2004. That was a lot of fun. I know Don Alex, who runs that site, very big fan of Andy Kaufman, and I really recommend that one as well. So I don't think there's such a thing as too many Andy Kaufman documentaries, is what I'm trying to say. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this interview, and definitely check out Thank You Very Much. It is playing at theaters and available through streaming on March 28th, 2025. How did you get involved in filmmaking?
I don't know that I ever really considered doing anything else. I initially thought of myself as heading into cinematographer direction because that was the part of films as a viewer that I was most excited about. And as soon as I realized how much precision and just lighting completely confused me, it almost felt like a magic trick. And I just gravitated more towards the storytelling side. And then as a filmmaker, wanted to have these real life experiences, which kind of pushed me into the documentary side. And I started out as a documentary cameraman, shooting nonfiction TV series. I worked on The First 48, which is about homicide investigations for many years, and sort of found my niche as someone willing to be around traumatic or dark or challenging subjects. After First 48, worked on some hospital documentary dramas. There was one called Hopkins on ABC, another one called Boston Med, which took place at Mass General. And basically just over time realized, again, there are other people that are better at holding the camera. I want to be behind that person, figuring out where the story goes. That's how I got into documentary filmmaking, but always had the idea that I want to make my own project, things that interest me my whole life and that I wouldn't get bored of in the very time-consuming process of making a film. Andy Kaufman is the subject that really stood out to me that I could dive into and never be bored.
What was your history with Andy Kaufman? When did you first remember seeing him?
The first thing I ever saw was the Carnegie Hall special. Andy Kaufman plays Carnegie Hall, and I have a bit of a unique history with that, or a unique way in, which is that my parents are both filmmakers, and in the 70s, before I was born, they were on the road together quite a bit, producing and directing a number of specials. They did Willie Nelson live at Lake Tahoe, and they put together a special with Tom Waits. I want to say it was in Chicago, and Dolly Parton, Richard Lewis, I'm in Pain was one of their projects together. But in the process of going to a lot of comedy clubs and filming a lot of comedians and being really immersed in that world, they came across Andy Kaufman in the late 70s. And when they heard that he was going to be doing a special at Carnegie Hall, they pitched that to Showtime, and Showtime went for it. And so the year before I was born, they, amongst many other filmmakers and producers and writers, including Bob Zmuda, they produced Andy Kaufman Plays Carnegie Hall. So growing up, this was one of a number of large beta tapes on the shelf, some of which were appropriate for a kid to watch and some of which weren't. And this one, I asked about it and they were like, oh, you're not going to believe, not only are you going to love the show, but you're not going to believe what happened afterwards. And they told me the story of Milk and Cookies, which as a kid really blew my mind, because this notion that a performance doesn't necessarily end when the show is over, it could keep going. That's something that really opened me up and just got me thinking about taking things at face value or looking a little deeper into them. That's how I became exposed to him and his work. And ever since then, I've just been more or less enchanted by everything he does.
How do you even begin to approach documentary about such a great subject, but also one that presents so many different facets to so many different people?
I'm not a worrier, but I think if I were, I would be worried, where to begin and how do I capture it properly. But I think I started thinking about what other films have been about him or included him, and what did they do well, and what do I still feel like I want to see that I haven't seen. And so one of the first things I thought about in posing that question to myself was like, I don't know that I had ever seen a film. First of all, I didn't think that there was really a definitive, just start to finish, top to bottom, like Kaufman documentary. There's Man on the Moon, which is an incredible biopic, great writers, great directors, amazing legendary performances. Like the legend of how that came together is just as interesting as the film itself, which of course segues to Jim and Andy, which is like an incredible film about acting and Jim Carrey's process and everything. But again, I'm starting from the place of I haven't seen a definitive Kaufman documentary, and what would I want to see if I went down that path? And the first thing I thought of was like, I just feel that his performances to fully get them, they need a little bit of time on screen for you to feel the pain or the awkwardness or the question that he's asking. And so the starting point for me was like, if I were showing someone that didn't know him at all or didn't know his work at all, what would the very first clip I would show them be? You get to feel that time and you get to feel the space and you get to feel the sort of tension with the audience, but it's exciting and interesting and funny and moving. And for me, that clip is in the film. It's that 1977 HBO Young Comic special where basically he starts out bombing and then he starts crying, and then the crying becomes rhythmical, and then the rhythmical crying leads to the drumming, which leads to the singing. So that piece, that was the first clip that I thought of where I was like, that has to be in the movie and it needs to be up front. And then one of the other things that I thought about was, what's the best way to present all this information to an audience, whether they're familiar with it or not? And I think in a lot of traditional documentaries about historical figures, you start at the beginning, whether that's their childhood or how they grew up, and then it leads to their influences, and eventually you get to them developing their act and whatever. And in this one, it was very clear to me from the beginning and very important to say, let's start with his act, because I think that's the way into understanding this guy and knowing what we're even talking about. It's not all of the interesting things that happened to him as a child or as a teenager or as a 20-something. They don't have the same level of meaning if you're just starting there. But if you know who he is and you know how he wound up and you know where all this is going, and then you get to look back and say, like, how did this guy come to be? That was another key early decision that we made as far as like how to approach the film and how to approach talking to these people that we wanted to talk to.
Yeah, your timeline is fascinating. Also, the use, of course, archival footage is wonderful, especially to see Danny DeVito years ago versus Danny DeVito now, and to get a little bit of a different perspective that he has now versus however many years ago that original interview he was giving was like.
The Charlie Rose, I think it is. Yeah. With the archive, we made a decision at some point. This isn't necessarily archive specific, but I'll get to that. We did make a decision. Let's only talk to people that knew Andy as a friend, as a collaborator, as a romantic partner, as a nemesis. But really, let's just only talk to people that were there between the years of 1949 and 1984. But then within that framework, following those rules, no piece of footage that we find is off the table as far as what we can use and how we can use it. So yeah, we have interviews that were shot, some as recently as 2023, some as far back that I shot, at least 2017. But then when we started going through box after box, we found interviews with people that some we knew we wanted to interview for the film, Danny being a good example. And then other boxes were filled with interviews of people who had died, whether it's recently or a while back, people that we didn't get to talk to. Those were treasures to find. But it was also really fun because we're dealing with a subject who the media was part of his canvas. He's not just a go on the Tonight Show or go on Letterman. He's using those shows and programs and the news and game shows and all these things. They're part of his act. So we just figured like any piece of media that we find can help stitch together a sort of texture that allows the audience to experience both what he's doing specifically, but also the waters he's playing in. Yeah, to be able to juxtapose a clip of Danny DeVito on Charlie Rose, probably, if I had to guess, that appearance is probably late 90s as Man in the Moon is coming in there and he's promoting it, but then getting to see him on Taxi in the late 70s and then talking to him now, present day. It felt fun to have the freedom to be able to jump around like that. There's that section when he's wrestling and there's a news broadcast talking about all the women he's wrestling around the world. And then when the broadcast concludes, the anchor continues on and tells another crazy story about a rabbi panel in Israel. And if you know the clip I'm talking about, it has nothing to do with Kaufman, but it's just when you're making any sort of documentary, whether it's a TV series or a film or whatever, you're constantly coming across all these little bits and pieces that you wish you could share with the world, but they really have no place in the film. And this was just one of those where I'm like, you know what? It has nothing to do with the film, but it does tell you a little bit about the world that we were living in at this period of time and what could have been on the news and how someone like Kaufman wound up on the news anyway. And so just my little revenge on all the straight jobs I've had over the years that wouldn't have allowed us to include that.
You're talking about the archives, like a certain place, somebody's garage, like where are you finding all these tapes?
When I first interviewed Bob Zmuda, which was in 2017, May 2017, that's when that interview in the film is from. We went to his house, and in the sort of ground/basement level of his house, there was a locked door. And at the conclusion of our interview with him, which lasted hours, he just made a comment about the door, the vault, whatever it was. And I was like, what's in there? And he was like, it's like everything that Kaufman ever did. And I was like, let's check it out. He's like, no, not yet. Like he held that over me for a while until the film was finally set up and financed and ready to go. But he took great pleasure in teasing the many spoils that hide behind that door. And so when we finally went into our post-production, my producer and I drove a van from LA back up to Lake Tahoe and just emptied that room out. And then it took months and months to go through all the boxes. And I think a lot of the stuff that's in there was just better quality versions of things that we had already seen. But then every third or fourth tape was like a mind-blowing discovery, because Bob, in his stewardship of comic relief, he's interfacing with all these different legendary comics and talking to them backstage about their experiences and memories of Kaufman. And we just found things that we didn't know existed before starting to edit. So that Gary Shandling clip of "I would still like to know who the real Andy is," that's something that we found in Bob's basement, along with old 8mm reels of the two of them kind of horsing around. And there's so much great stuff that didn't even get to make it into the film, but a large portion of what we included in the film came from those discoveries. And then some things, we found our own along the way as well.
Was everybody pretty willing to talk to you? Did you have anybody who was hesitant or just said, no, I'm not going to go on the record?
Everyone that you see in the film was pretty willing to talk. And then there are some people that you might expect to see in the film that aren't in the film. And those are the people that didn't want to. There are plenty of people that I would have liked to have spoken to that aren't in the movie. And then there are plenty of people that wanted to talk to us that we didn't feel the need to. But yeah, I would say, I don't think that there's a different story we would have told one way or the other, but I do think some people were super eager and other people wanted to remain out of it. Does anyone stand out to you as missing?
Not really. No, you don't necessarily have to pay lip service to the movie. You didn't have to talk with the writers. Obviously, Milos is gone, but even having archival stuff of him, I think the movie's the movie, but your movie's a totally different thing. You're fulfilling what I was hoping for with that Man in the Moon movie, not to cast aspersions, but after I got out of it, I was like, I'd really like to see a really good documentary about Andy rather than the biopic.
It's a great film on its own, and it introduced a whole new generation of people that were my age at the time to Andy, and it's super fun and great and holds up. But it's the same thing with, after I went and watched A Complete Unknown, what I really wanted to do was go and listen to Bob Dylan albums. And this is a symbiotic relationship where one informs the other and fuels the desire. Like, you want both. You always want both.
What was the reaction to the documentary when it first came out?
The festival screenings that we've participated in have been incredible. And I think the surprising thing is, obviously, anyone of a certain age who's familiar with Kaufman and already knows that they love him, like, I think they're going to enjoy the movie. But the people who are really most taken with it are most surprised or blown away or enthusiastic are just like younger people. So the first screening that we had publicly was at the Venice International Film Festival. And for whatever reason, I don't know how word got out, but the crowd was just really young and their minds were blown. And I think it's just to a certain extent, like Kaufman's spirit it's a youthful spirit. And I think he helps us understand that not only are certain rules meant to be broken, they're just completely made up and shouldn't really exist to begin with. And that's a very freeing idea to embrace. So that's the most surprising and most interesting and most pleasing reaction that we've got, is just like young people are really into this. And so it's exciting for me to think that maybe they'll have another generation to inspire.
I almost wonder if the Tim and Eric's or some of these other comedians that are, I hate the term anti-comedy, but just like that discomfort, it feels like people who are into them would find Kaufman to be very much a similar thing.
Tim and Eric or Nathan Fielder or Sacha Baron Cohen and Kaufman, of course, they're all interesting in the sense that they challenge you to just slightly take a closer look at how information is presented to you. You know what I mean? That's what they all do to me. So for Kaufman, he's asking you to take a closer look at like the audience performer relationship. And I think those people that I mentioned, they're in the same legacy in that they're like demanding that we are a little bit more critical of, information and how it's presented to us. So whether you want to call it a certain name or whatever, I think people use the word cringe because it's an awkward feeling to be confronted with how we're being manipulated a lot of the time. That's what makes all those people that you mentioned so brilliant and so fresh and so interesting for me. Like those are people whose work I never get sick of as well.
So what's next for you, or what have you already done? Because I think that you did festivals in 2023. Is that right?
Did festivals in 2023 and a little bit in 2024. And my time is just being spent making sure that as many people see this as possible when it comes out. First of all, I'm being asked not to talk about the next thing I'm working on, not by anyone involved in this, but just people I'm working with. But I'm truly setting aside a good amount of time right now to just promote, and it's a real joy to be able to do that, because even after having lived in this Kaufman world for so long, it's something I could never be sick of. And I'm excited to get as many people out there and exposed to it as possible.
Is there a good place for people to keep up with you in the film online?
There is a website, drafthousefilms.com/thank you very much. And we're playing in around 20 different cities, I think, theatrically, around 35 screens right now. That could pick up depending on how the first week of showings goes. But yeah, we're super excited. We're opening in New York and Los Angeles. I think we're going to have some additional theaters in the New York area, Bronxville, Pelham. It's going to be playing in Austin, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee. And so I think just as things pick up, hopefully it'll go wider and wider. But it's also available for rent and for purchase, VOD, same day. So for anyone that is not in one of those markets or wants to watch it at home, it's going to be available on Amazon and Apple and all those places where we go to rent films too.
Well, yeah, I hope more people check it out, because I had a great time watching it.
Thanks.